Hey everyone, Caleb Nelson here with DFSForecast. I'm here today to give you a tutorial on our NFL Optimizer. I built this lineup generator specifically to take down GPP contests. I did this by data mining previous Milli Maker winners and incorporating their trends into the optimizer. By using the strategy, I've won a Milli Maker myself, as well as 9 other 100K contests between NFL and NBA. The following video will give you a rundown on all of our optimizer's features. Whether you're new to DFS or a seasoned vet, we want to give you the best chance at shipping your own DFS tournament. Let's get started. DFSForecast is set up so you can get more and more specific with your lineup builds as you follow the tabs to the right. You can almost think of it as beginner, intermediate, and advanced. Before I get started on the player table, I want to highlight one of our most important features, which is our Use Presets button. This feature will tailor the build settings and team stack settings to what winning lineups have done in the past for the current slate size that you're on. It obviously won't guarantee a winning build, but it puts up the bumpers so that you can be sure every single lineup you make has at least the chance of winning a tournament. What better way to ship a tournament than to imitate winners from the past? If you don't have much time and you want to build competitive lineups, just hit the Use Presets button and run it. The Players tab is the main hub where you can view and edit projections and exposures for each player. I'm going to give you a rundown on what each of these columns mean. To the left, we have player information like their name, salary, position, team. Then we have the team's Vegas odds for the week. And next we have all the players' projections. This first column here is just the median projected points, and it's the default input to the optimizer. You can make quick edits by typing here. Next are the two value columns. So value is a way that people can talk about players' projected points relative to their salaries. This way we can compare players at different salary levels. This first column is just raw projected value. That's taking their projected points and dividing it by their salary. When I sort on this column, you can see it weighs heavily towards QBs, who generally have the highest median projections. And even after filtering out QBs, you can see it's weighted towards low salary players. So this is a useful column to get a quick idea of who projects well for their given salary, but you can't win a GPP by just picking out low salary players. So I wouldn't recommend using just this column to get the top plays of the week. We reconcile this with our very own GPP value column. This is a metric which attempts to show the true salary weighted value for a given player at a given position. When I sort on this column, you can see we get a much clearer list of who the best plays are on the slate. To highlight the difference between projected value and GPP value, we can filter on wide receivers and compare Romeo Doubs to Justin Jefferson. Doubs had the highest projected raw value on the slate with his 3K salary, and he was a solid play. But Justin Jefferson had a much better chance to break the slate with his massive raw projected score, even relative to his salary, which led to him being a very strong play. Up next, we have the ceiling projections. This shows a player's 75th percentile outcome. Obviously, you want players to have high ceilings if you want to ship a GPP. Next two columns are just the projected ownership, and you can make edits by typing here. Lastly, the exposure columns allow you to force players into your build or limit them. If you're making 100 lineups and min exposure is set to 20, Justin Jefferson will show up in 20 lineups. Similarly, if max exposure is set to 50, Justin Jefferson will show up in no more than 50 lineups. One feature that I like to use at the start of my builds is the Set Global Max Exposure button. This feature will set the max exposure for all players depending on their position and exclude any players with very low projected points. Now the numbers I use in this example are all very generalized. What you're going to use is going to depend on the specific slate and slate size that you're on. But here are example numbers that I might start with, which I then adjust as the week develops. So generally I don't want over 40% exposure to any one QB. So I'm going to change all QB's max exposure to 40 by typing 40 here. I also don't want to include any QBs with projected points less than 5, say like a backup who's just expected to get a few snaps here and there. So I'm going to leave this at 5 here. It'd be very unlikely that a QB with low projected points would make it in a lineup anyways, but just to be safe, I want to exclude them altogether. Going through the rest of these, running backs, I'm more comfortable with having higher max exposure, so we'll set this to 60. Wide receivers, let's go with 50. Tight ends, 40. And defenses, very volatile position. I don't want more than 25% to any one defense. All right, so I push OK. And as you can see, the max exposures have been adjusted for all my positions. The only player it didn't set it for was Justin Jefferson, as you can see right here. And that's because I already adjusted his exposures, and this feature won't override existing exposures unless you tell it to. Cool. Now that I've got my player table set up, I'm going to jump over to the build settings. The build settings are general parameters that give you control over every lineup. The first thing I do on this page is make sure presets are enabled. I already did this on the Players tab, but just to show you again, when I reset the settings, then hit Use Presets, all my settings are updated to mirror what winners have done in the past. Enabling presets will give you competitive lineups with no additional work, but in case you want more levels of customization, I'm going to explain each of these settings. Let's start with bracketed ownership. To win a large field GPP tournament, you obviously want to play studs that project well. But if you only play high projected, high owned players, you aren't going to differentiate yourself enough from the field to take first place. Bracketed ownership is a way you can force a couple low-owned guys in your lineup that give you the differentiation needed to take down a tournament. Here you can see every lineup will have at least one player under 5% owned and 3 players under 10% owned. It also ensures that you don't have too many low-owned guys in your lineup. The top range of this bracket is 4, which means you can't have more than 4 players under 2.5% in any lineup. I attribute a lot of my DFS success to building lineups in this manner, and I highly encourage you to do the same. Bracketed ownership is one parameter that I almost never manually change from the presets. Okay, next up is flex parameters. These are global settings to limit certain positions from occupying the flex spot. This one is more slate dependent and a personal preference, but unless there are multiple really good tight ends on a large slate, I usually turn down the tight end flex parameter to 10%. So if I'm building 100 lineups, at most 10 lineups will have a tight end occupying the flex spot. It doesn't prevent the optimizer from having, say, 0 lineups with the tight end in the flex spot. It just means that there can't be more than 10. Wide receivers and running backs, I generally just let it ride at 100%. Down here we have the randomness settings. I usually leave everything at medium, except for defense I'll bump up to high since it's the most volatile position. If you wanted to make a pure optimal lineup, you'd want to set all the sliders to none, which takes all randomness out for projected points. And I personally never change the randomness on projected ownership from medium. Lastly, we have the final sliders. The min-max salary slider I never change from the presets. Total ownership, I might increase the top slider since I'm okay with total ownership being high so long as I have a few low-owned players as per the rules we set in bracketed ownership. The minimum unique players tells the optimizer that each lineup has to be different from each other. I don't change this from 1. And lastly, for the ceiling projection blend, I usually slide up between 50% and 100%. This setting will blend the projected median points with the projected ceiling points for each player. So again, I just want to emphasize that most of these settings don't need to be changed after you hit the presets button. This feature will do the legwork for you unless you really want extra customization. Now that we have our build settings tuned, it's time to edit our team stack settings. Welcome to the team stack settings. This page is where you can really give yourself an advantage over the competition. This tab is set up in 2 parts. The upper part is where you'll set your stacking percentages, and the bottom part is where you'll customize your team-specific rules. First, I want to introduce the global stack settings. These control how often and in what ways your lineups get stacked. As with previous tabs, DFSForecast does the legwork for you with the presets feature. By pushing this button, all the stack settings are tuned to previous Milli Maker winners, and you'll be on your way to making competitive lineups. But let me give you a rundown on what each of these settings mean. This first input is the team stack percentage. For those of you unfamiliar with this term, a team stack is when you pair a QB with a wide receiver, tight end, or less commonly a running back from the same team. The idea is to capture positive correlation. If a QB throws a long touchdown pass, then one of his teammates is also getting points for that TD pass. Most winning lineups have a stack, and the only time I move this input down from the preset value is if I know there's a cheap running QB that can score a lot of points without throwing the ball. Justin Fields before he got expensive, for example. The next input is the game stack percentage. Similar to a team stack, a game stack is when a player from the QB's opposing team is included in the lineup. This also captures positive correlation. If a team's QB is scoring a lot of points by passing the ball, it's likely that the opposing team will have to catch up, which results in more fantasy points. Lastly, the force 2 flex percentage is the same as a team stack, but, you guessed it, the optimizer forces 2 players from the same team as the QB. The idea is the same. If the QB is going to throw for a lot of fantasy points, you want pass catchers from that team to soak up those points. This next box, allow running back stack percentage, sets a limit on how many lineups can have a running back stacked with his QB. Many times it's not advantageous for a running back to be stacked with his QB because they often have negative correlation. If a running back is rushing for a touchdown, that means his QB isn't receiving points. You probably don't want to prohibit a running back in a QB stack altogether, but you also don't want all your stacks to be with running backs. This metric is a way to limit the number of running back stacks without prohibiting them altogether. A secondary game stack forces 2 players from opposing teams into a lineup together without their QB. So you can have your primary game stack and then another secondary game stack. An example from 2022 Week 1 would be rostering both Austin Eckler and Devontae Adams without either Justin Herbert or Derek Carr in the same lineup. It's just another way to capture positive correlation between players. The thought behind a forced running back plus defense stack is that if a team's defense is doing well, then it likely means the team is winning. Therefore, it's more likely that the team will run the ball more, so the running back will benefit from its defense doing well. I don't personally subscribe to this, but enough people enjoy the stack that we've added the functionality. Lastly, we have force no stack percentage. As the name suggests, this input controls how often you get a lineup with no stacks, also called naked lineups. This is different than just leaving the team stack percent at less than 100%. For example, at 95%, we could still get 100% of lineups with a team stack, they just won't be forced. If we put 5% at the force no stack percentage, then we would guarantee 5% of lineups without a stack. I personally am a big fan of stacking, so I always leave this at 0. And for these last 2 boxes, you almost never want to play a defense with a player from the opposing team because they are very negatively correlated. If a player scores, then the opposing team loses points. I really only check the allowed defense versus flex box if it's a very small slate. Now we get to the team-specific stacking options. When I was first building this optimizer, one of my main goals was to cut down on the number of specific player groups you often had to make. It frustrated me having to make different groups for every single team in QB to control stack settings. So I wanted to make an intuitive way to control team-specific rules with the click of a button. This is what's worked for me. Let me go through these columns to explain what they all mean and how I'd adjust them using the 2022 Week 1 main slate as an example. The naked QB column controls which teams you allow to have an unstacked quarterback. The only times I allow a QB to be unstacked is if they have huge rushing upside. So the first thing I do is uncheck it for all teams. Then I go through and include teams with quarterbacks that have solid rushing upside, like the Cardinals, Ravens, Bears, and the Eagles with Jalen Hurts. So in the 5% of lineups where a naked QB is possible, based on this setting, it will only happen with these checked teams. This next column I never change. I'll allow any QB to have a team stack. This column allows you to select which specific positions you'll allow in a stack for each team. I always want to allow a wide receiver or a tight end, but I only want to stack a running back with a QB if he's likely to catch passes. So let me start by unchecking all running backs, then going through to select pass catchers or running backs in good environments. So I like CMC, Joe Mixon, I like Swift here, JT, and of course, Eckler. The next column is one of the most important. This is what sets the min and max number of stacked players that the optimizer will allow for each team's QB. It's basically telling the optimizer, if this team's QB is in the lineup, what are the minimum and maximum number of teammates you also want to include in the lineup. For the minimum, I never change it from 1. I'll always allow any QB to be stacked with just one of his teammates. Setting the maximum is where you'll want to do most of your work. The default is at 3, but I generally want to keep teams between 1 and 2. And I only want to allow a double stack if the team is projected to score a lot of points, or if I have a lot of exposure to that team. So the first thing I do is set the maximum to 1, then sort by the Vegas implied point total. I then go through and increase the maximum to 2 for teams that I think can support a double stack. So Mahomes, Herbert, Jalen Hurts. I always want to allow a double stack. I didn't trust Matt Ryan this week given he'd be in a new offense, so I left the Colts at max 1 despite the high Vegas total. Burrow, I always like to double. Lamar, I left at 1 this week just because I didn't like the game environment and I thought that he'd get most of his production on the ground, so he couldn't support a double stack. Dolphins, I also left at 1. This is probably a mistake because Tyreek and Waddle can go off any week against any opponent. I probably would have wanted them to be at 2. Lastly, I like the Vikings, Raiders, and Cardinals game environment. And that rounds out the teams that I allowed to be double stacked. This next column is also important. It determines the maximum number of players you want from the same team if their QB isn't in the lineup. In a similar vein to the max stacked players, I usually want to keep this at 1 unless it's an explosive offense. For this week, I mirrored the max stacked players column. So first I'm going to change the max to 1 for all teams, and then I'm going to go through and change it to 2 for the best teams. Bengals, I want to allow 2 even if Burrow isn't in the lineup. Same with the Vikings, same with the Raiders, and same for the Cardinals. Cool. For this game stack column, I never uncheck for any team. This column doesn't force a game stack, it just determines which QBs are allowed to be in a game stack. I always want to allow this, so I leave everything checked. As the name suggests, opposing stack position sets the positions for the QB's opposing team that are eligible to be in a game stack. I generally don't touch this column much. I'm fine with a running back, wide receiver, or tight end to be the bring back in a game stack. But I just want to be clear that this is setting the positions for the opposing team. So on this first row, if you uncheck running back, you're excluding a Cardinals running back from being in a game stack with Patrick Mahomes. This next column controls which games are eligible for a secondary game stack. Remember forced secondary game stack up here. This controls how often lineups will have a forced secondary game stack. If you want to disallow certain games from being in a secondary game stack, you'll want to uncheck them here. Typically, I don't want secondary game stacks with bad environments, so I'm going to sort by the over-under and uncheck the lower games. You'll notice that it unchecks for both teams in that game. Finally, we have the running back and defense stacks. Similar to the last column, this controls which teams you want to allow to have a running back stacked with his defense. I honestly don't mess around with this column too much because I don't force any of these stacks. But if you do use it, you'd want to only include teams that are projected to win and that have a workhorse running back. And there you have it. Hopefully this gives you an idea of how the presets control the global stack settings and how you can gain an edge over the competition by easily tuning your team-specific stacking rules. The final tab is player groups, which allows even more control over the player combinations. As I mentioned before, you can eliminate the need for many groups by using the presets feature in the stacking tab. However, sometimes you might want further customization that is only possible with a specific grouping rule in place. Here are some examples of when I might want to resort to using groups. Let's take the Bengals. They have a high-powered offense centered around Joe Burrow and 2 alpha wide receivers, Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. If Joe Burrow is going to be the QB in the winning Millie Maker lineup, it is very likely that the majority of his production is going to go through these 2 wide receivers. However, the Bengals also have secondary pieces that might stack well with Burrow, like Tyler Boyd, low-priced Hayden Hurst, or even Joe Mixon out of the backfield. I don't want to eliminate these secondary pieces from being stacked with Burrow altogether, but I don't want them stacked with Burrow alone. For example, I don't want a Burrow stack with just Hayden Hurst in the lineup. I want, if Burrow is going to be the winning QB, he's going to need more than just Hayden Hurst. So therefore, I'm going to make a group where if Burrow is in the lineup, then either Jamar Chase or T. Higgins must be in the lineup as well. So how we're going to do this is by first adding a group. I'm just going to change the name really quick to if Burrow, then Chase Higgins. Helps just to keep the groups all straight. Then I'm going to add all 3 players. Burrow. All right. From there, I'm going to anchor on Joe Burrow. This means that the group rule will only apply if Joe Burrow is in the lineup. Next, I'm going to set the minimum to 2 and the maximum to 3. This tells the optimizer that if Joe Burrow is in the lineup, then I want at least 2 of Burrow, Chase, and Higgins. AKA, Chase and Higgins must also be in the lineup as well. Now again, this doesn't prevent a double stack with, say, Burrow, Chase, and Tyler Boyd, or Burrow, Higgins, and Hayden Hurst. It just means one of Chase and Higgins is going to be included with Burrow as desired. Another example of when I use groups is to just simply force a few mini stacks. Last year, week 1, I really liked the Raiders-Chargers game. It had a high over-under with nearly all the players coming in below 10% ownership. I might have had plenty of exposure to Eckler and Adams individually, but given their high price tag, I wanted to make sure I had a few lineups with them together. To do this, let's make a new group and call it Eckler Adams Mini and add them both to the group. First, I'm going to set the minimum to 2. This tells the optimizer that both players must be in this lineup. And then I'm going to change the percent to, something like 4. This tells the optimizer to enforce this rule only 4% of the time. So 4% of the time, I want a minimum of 2 of Eckler and Adams. I only did 4 because I don't want to go overboard, but this guarantees at least a few of my 150 lineups will have Eckler and Adams. I don't recommend getting too crazy and making a ton of specific mini stacks, as it can contradict other rules or exposures you have in place, and that just breaks the build altogether. So just be careful, and if you're having issues completing your build, I recommend deleting unnecessary mini stacks. Regardless, I hope this video gave you an idea of how you might want to use player groups in the future. Once you have all your settings tuned how you'd like, push the Build button, and you'll be sent here to the Lineups tab. Lineups will automatically be sorted by projected points, and you can also sort them by projected ownership. You can save specific lineups by clicking the star next to them, and they will show up here in the Saved Lineups tab. This is useful for if you're max entering big contests, but also want to save a few of your best lineups for 3 max or single entry contests. And of course, you can click here to download your lineups to then be uploaded to DraftKings or FanDuel. So going through these information columns, this first one's obviously total salary used. These next 2 are the team stack and game stacks. So a value of 1 here shows that Joe Burrow is stacked with 1 running back, wide receiver, or tight end from his same team. So in this case, it's T. Higgins. Game stack value of 1 means that it's the same from the opposing team. Week 1, 2022, they played the Steelers, so that would be George Pickens here. The next 2 columns are just the total projected ownership and the total projected points. These next 3 are the total number of players under 10%, 5%, and 2.5% ownership. Just kind of gives a quick visual to make sure you have enough low-owned players in your lineup to differentiate yourself from the field. And this last column here is the edit column. So you can click here and a box will pop up and you can adjust your lineup on the go. And next we're going to head to the analysis tab to get a summarized view of the build. This is the analysis tab. Here you can see your player exposures, top stacks, and comparisons to previous winners. Off the bat, you can see the top players you're overweight and underweight to. You can think of these as, which players am I rooting for? For example, this shows that my exposure to Justin Jefferson is 17% more than the field as indicated by his projected ownership. Similarly, I have about 11% less exposure to Jonathan Taylor than the field. In the player breakdown section, you can look at your highest exposures by position. If you find a player you have too little or too much of, you can change their exposure settings right here. For example, I really liked Saquon Barkley week 1 last year, but my current build only gave me 23%. I want to have at least 10% more than the field, so I'm going to set his minimum exposure so next time I build lineups, I'll have at least 35% of Saquon Barkley. These changes will automatically be reflected in the Players tab. Similarly, when I go to the Wide Receiver Breakdown tab, Randall Cobb is my 6th highest wide receiver. Cobb is solid for his price, but I just don't trust he has the ceiling needed to win a large tournament, so I'm going to lower his max exposure to about what the field ownership is. Next up, we have the stacks breakdown. This just shows you what team stack combinations you're ending up with a lot of. In my case, I have a lot of Mahomes double stacks with Juju and Travis Kelce. Lastly, we have the lineup comparison section. This shows you trends from previous Millie Makers of the same slate size. So for Millie Makers with a slate size of 13 games, we can see that top 5 finishers had a team stack 98% of the time, top 50 finishers 91% of the time, all cashing lineups 82% of the time, and all losing lineups just 80% of the time. This shows a clear trend that winning lineups use stacks more than losing lineups. Top 5 do it more than top 50, which do it more than cash, which do it more than losing lineups. With a trend as predictive as this, you want to be as close to the top 5 finishers as possible, in which case we are. This shouldn't be used as gospel, as it doesn't take into account the uniqueness of the current slate, but it is a helpful tool to review once or twice to make sure your builds are on the right track. Alright, this wraps up this tutorial. Again, I'm Caleb Nelson with DFSForecast. Thanks for listening, and if you have any questions, shoot us a DM on Twitter or send us an email. Good luck this season.